Went right through that one. We'll now start with section 2. So this one, people I think had a little trouble on the study guide, and I think I need to make the question a little bit more clear. The relationship between the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, and Sumer. I was just looking geographically. So the Fertile Crescent is the biggest. It includes all three, right? Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Sumer form the Fertile Crescent. Mesopotamia is the land between two rivers, and it includes this little bit called Sumer. Sumer is the smallest bit. Sumer is inside and part of Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, and Sumer and Mesopotamia together with Egypt form the Fertile Crescent. That's all that I was trying to get there, because I use those terms interchangeably sometimes, and I want to make clear what I mean by them. And also I want us to see the kind of relationship between Egypt and Mesopotamia. What led to the rise of states in Mesopotamia? Well, remember, Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flood unpredictably. Right? People don't know when they're going to flood, and when they flood at different distances, and they can do a huge amount of damage. So you need flood control. You need to build dams and dikes and reservoirs to try and deal with those floods. And also, to take advantage of the rivers, you need complex irrigation systems, right? This is a very dry area, but if you can irrigate it, then you can start growing crops. But in order to do those things, to build an irrigation system, to undertake flood control, you have to mobilize and organize a lot of people, right? This is more than one person can do. It's more than one family can do. You need a government to mobilize and organize this many people. And the thing is, people were just naturally kind of lazy. Work is hard. And people often agree that work needs to be done, but we don't want to be the ones who do it. So you need a government who can organize the work and then force people to work when necessary, right? Some people will be willing to work, but then if other people are lazy and aren't doing their part, those first people will say, well, I don't want to work if these people aren't working. So you need a government who can not only organize the work, but can make people work when it's for the benefit of everyone. What is meant by saying that a state is legitimate? And what I wanted people to kind of get here was this idea of, and I use this example of paying taxes, right? So, if I were to come into this class and demand that you pay me a tax, not only would you refuse, you would say you don't have the right to demand a tax, right? A legitimate government is a government that has the right to tax you, right? I'm not a legitimate government. I cannot tax you. In the United States, we accept the American government as having the right to tax us because we're a democracy, right? We say this government is legitimate because we have elections in which we can vote freely to choose our leaders, right? That's the nature of democracy. That's why we accept those taxes that we have to pay as legitimate. You may not like paying the government taxes. You may do your best to legally avoid paying taxes, right, through loopholes or something like that, tax shelters and the like, but you won't say, oh, the government doesn't have the right to tax me. Now, in the ancient world, what I tried to emphasize was that people did not have democracies, except for the Greeks and Romans, who we'll talk about later. They had gods and kings, right? They believed that the kings ruled by the favor of the gods, that they were kind of the gods representative on earth, that they had a special relationship with the gods, and therefore the king had the right to tax, right? That's different. They determine legitimacy by religion. We do it by democracy. Right? This is the legitimate government because the king has a special relationship with the gods. That's why we accept the king. We had this question, how did religion help lead to writing? And it's interesting because basically it seems, and the example we used was the earliest writing system we know of, cuneiform, was temples, right? People worship the gods. The gods give them a favor, so they want to donate money to the temple. And the temple wants to perform its social and economic functions of giving people money that need it. Right? I donate some grain to the temple. Okay, now there's a famine. People are starving. The temple is going to release grain so people don't starve. Right? And that's good not only for those people, it's good for social order. But you have to keep track of this. You don't know how much grain to release if you don't know how much grain you have. Right? You don't want to tell people, yeah, we're going to give you grain, and then you go and you see you don't have any. So they had to keep track of what was coming in and what was going out in terms of these donations. And at first it seems like they just drew pictures, like you draw a picture of a pig or a sheep or wheat, and then you made like tally marks. But eventually they started making these things abbreviated. They started realizing these pictures could stand for more than just a noun. It could be used to represent sounds or verbs or other things and complex ideas. So we're going to go from simple administration to poetry, and of course the highest form of writing, historical writing. That's the best. So who are the Phoenicians? How did their writing spread? Why is their writing important? So the Phoenicians were a group of merchants. That their civilization started here, basically modern-day Israel, but as merchants, they moved around. Remember, merchants make a living by going someplace where something is rare, and buying it there. Or, I'm sorry, they make a living by buying things where it's common and cheap and going someplace else and then selling it where it is rare and expensive. So they have to travel. That's what merchants do. They travel around. So they traveled around. Why is that important? Well, they developed an alphabet. Right? They developed this alphabet here, which is related to our alphabet that we use when writing English or Spanish or pretty much any European language in Western Europe. And so they spread that around. These areas around them did not have their own written languages, so they just borrowed that of the Phoenicians. Right? So the Phoenicians are this group of merchant people who traveled around and who developed the alphabet that we use today when writing Western European, Central European languages. Okay, what are the characteristics of warfare in Mesopotamia? This one is a little bit more complex. So first of all, I'm not going to go through all this because this was not the question except for the last part. Right? There was an understanding that victories in war between city-states were connected to cosmic battles between the gods. Remember, people believed that if there was a war on earth between two cities, that meant that in heaven their patron gods were fighting. Right? So if two cities, we'll say city A that worships Marduk, city B that worships Dagon, are fighting, it was believed that in heaven those two gods were fighting. And whichever god won in heaven, their city on earth also was victorious. And that kind of justified their victory, right? You know, it's like, okay, we won because our God is bigger and better than your God, so you have to do what we say. So that's one element of this warfare. But a lot of the warfare was driven by people's desire to have access to more resources. This could be land, it could be raw materials such as copper or tin, or it could be even other people, right? If you rule more people, that's more taxes, and unfortunately during this time period it was common to enslave people who you defeated. So you could just make them your slaves and then they have to work for you for free. And there were also people fought for access over trade routes. Remember, that's what Tutmosis III was doing when he took the city of Megiddo. Now, sometimes people just won these things and didn't care, but other times it was just unclear who owned them, right? Boundaries were not always clear between city-states, and so people would fight. And of course, people also want to be number one, right? People, want to be top dog. It's just kind of our nature, it would seem. And, if there's no UN to settle your issue for you, if there is no compromise, then you have nothing to do but fight. And some people were really good at fighting and were able to expand their territory, and that led to people like Sargon, who we've talked about before. Now, why did Mesopotamia go into decline? Why is the region important despite that? Well, Mesopotamia goes into decline probably because of environmental factors such as over-farming, over-irrigation. Whenever you irrigate, you bring minerals like salts from the river into the soil, and over time, if you build up too much salt, it reduces the fertility of the soil. So we had this very complex system, this very complex agriculture, and the problem was eventually, of course, it wasn't sustainable. And we have this, I talked earlier about how once you get lots of good food supply going, that allows specialization and all these other wonderful things. It also runs in reverse. When food supply goes down, then civilization starts to decline. Right, so that's what's going to happen here. So we don't think of this area anymore as a breadbasket. It's not a particularly fertile area, even though it had once been. Now, why is it important despite that? Well, remember the video clip showed us how a lot of the civilizations that we looked at later, like India and Egypt, are along a similar latitude, right? So the climate is the same, right? If you move east to west, the climate doesn't change much. If you move north-south, it changes a lot. So what happened was the people here didn't stay and just starve to death. When the food production went down, a lot of them moved. And when they moved, they took with them their advanced agriculture and their domesticated animals, and they spread them to places like Egypt and India and Southern Europe. So they're important because they spread that knowledge, even though the area itself went into decline. How was the Nile different from the Tigris and Euphrates? How did they influence the Egyptian worldview? How did the Nile affect farming? What did it allow Egyptians to do? So the Nile, remember, Egypt is another river civilization. And the Nile is completely different from the Tigris and Euphrates because it is a predictable river that floods a regular distance at a regular time. So Egyptians knew about when the river would flood. They knew how far it would flood and how deep the water would be. So they could live much more safe lives. And this is one reason why they tend to have a more benevolent view of the gods. They thought the gods were friendly because their environment was friendlier. So this meant farming was easy and productive for the Egyptians. And that means that if it's not hard to farm, it's easy to farm, then you have extra time and energy to develop a civilization, right? If you have to work 14 hours a day, you don't have much time to write poetry. But if you only have to work a couple hours a day, you have a lot more time to write poetry and do art and things like that. And they will become particularly adept at engineering and religion. And I tried to emphasize how you can see that come together in the pyramids, right? And we saw that over and over again in this class, right? Remember Hatshepsut, in order to emphasize her legitimacy as a female pharaoh, she had this temple built, and in the temple she had artwork that presented herself as being descended from a god. So that brings us to the next question. How were engineering and religion connected in Egypt? Well, just like in Mesopotamia, it was believed that the pharaohs had a special relationship with the gods or were gods. I give you an or there because, we're talking about civilization that went on for several thousand years, and their ideas changed over time. But the key thing is they had some kind of special connection with the gods. And they were understood as the gods' intermediary on earth, and they were therefore responsible for maintaining order in this world. And so they were very important political leaders. And when they died, they would have a tomb, and on top of the tomb you would build one of these massive pyramids. And these things are impressive today to look at. Like I said, when we went out to go see the pyramids, we could see them, but it still took, I think, like an hour on the bus to get to them. So, if you were a peasant, you could see them, but you knew that if you walked all day, you wouldn't even get to them. That's how, big and impressive these things are. You can see them from so far away. And you got to think, wow, I can certainly believe that Egypt has a divine pharaoh when he is able to have such a huge structure built. And that means there's something special about the pharaoh and something special about us Egyptians. And that's key for helping the country to keep going, right? That's why we talk about how Egypt would fall apart, but always put itself back together. This naturally encourages stability and social order. Okay. We had this question, number 23, who were Amenhotep IV and Nefertiti? What was their relationship like? How they challenged tradition and try and expand their own power? How successful were they? So remember, I talked about them as a power couple. Amenhotep IV was a pharaoh. Remember, he also goes by the name of Akhenaten, but I only expect you to remember Amenhotep IV. His wife, Nefertiti, was not a pharaoh, right? But she was an important advisor. And I emphasized how in this artwork we see here, she's almost as big as him. And in ancient art, size is not to scale, size is to importance, right? The bigger you are, the more important you are. So she was an advisor to him. So he was someone who took her ideas seriously. So their relationship was very close. He took her very seriously, almost one of equals. And one thing we want to emphasize about them, remember, they challenged tradition. They were quite happy to question old traditions. And one thing, in this piece of art, right, Amenhotep is kissing his child, right? And Nefertiti has another child on her lap and is embracing another child as well. So there's this idea of them challenging tradition by showing themselves as family people in a sense, rather than just these kind of placid gods who just sit there and don't really do much. My apologies. Now, they challenged tradition other ways and tried to expand their own power by challenging the traditional religion. Where the priests were very wealthy. The priests of the old gods were very wealthy. They had a lot of social, political, and economic power. And Amenhotep IV and Nefertiti wanted that power, so they tried to create their own religion, which was basically monotheistic. They said that really the only true God is the sun god, and we should just worship that god. And of course, the priests, if they worship gods that don't exist, you shouldn't pay them any attention. Why would you donate money or participate in rituals sponsored by people whose gods don't exist, right? What's the point? And so this was an effort to weaken them. Remember, they built their own new capital city where their own gods were exalted. And remember, they also tried to exalt themselves. They demanded that people bow down to them in ways that people had not traditionally had to do to Egyptian rulers. So that's how they're going to try and break with that tradition and try and gain power. But when they died, everything just went back the way it was, right? They were limited success, right? They weren't able to institutionalize these changes. In traditional civilizations, powerful individuals can change things for a time, but it's a little bit harder to make those changes last, right? And that's what we saw here. Okay, what led to the Bronze Age collapse? What was its significance? In some ways, the Bronze Age collapse is very similar to what happened in Mesopotamia, right? It seems that there were environmental issues and decline in food production, and this affected not just Mesopotamia, but the entire Fertile Crescent, so including Egypt. And the problem is then, okay, if people don't have food, they're going to try and get food any way they can, including stealing it. So people will become bandits, and if they run out of food in their country, they'll invade someone else's country. Right, so this is a major problem. And then the government has to focus not only on trying to deal with the food problem, it has to focus on what do we do with these bandits and these invaders. And that means that since they have to focus on those guys, they have less attention to irrigation, so they're not able to restore the irrigation works, keep them repaired. Food production goes down even more. They also can't take care of their trade routes. So people cannot, now even more people cannot get enough food to eat, and they can't trade safely. So you can think about it this way. Civilizations are very complex systems built on food production, right? If you can produce enough food, you have specialization. You have people who can do things other than just produce food. Once food production goes down, all those other things go down. And that's what happens during this period, and it affected the whole of the Fertile Crescent. And it would take centuries for places like Egypt to recover from this. But what's very important for our purposes in terms of why this is significant is it gives space for new kingdoms to develop. One of which is in the next question, what are the characteristics of Judaism? What is the Ark of the Covenant? What is special about the Jewish temple? Israel probably would not have been able to develop unless there had been this decline. Right? That was one of the new kingdoms that there will be space now to develop. So under Judaism, we talked about originally the Hebrews are these nomadic pastoralists, people who move around to take care of their animals, who were enslaved by the Egyptians. Moses led them out of Egypt sometime in the 13th century. And Jews believe, as well as Christians, that God made a covenant with the Jews in which the Jews recognized God as the one true God, the one God that they would follow, and God promised to bless them in return. And part of this was receiving the Ten Commandments. These rules, the first rule of which was, you shall have no other God before me. And they put the Ten Commandments and some other things into this thing called the Ark of the Covenant, pictured there, which is basically just like a big box they could carry with them. And they thought that God dwelled in the Ark of the Covenant in a special way. And they understood this covenant as their identity, right? If you turned away from God, if you turned away from the covenant, that was turning away from being a Hebrew. It was turning away from being Jewish. So this gave them a very, very strong sense of identity, a sense of who they were, which would survive them losing their kingdom. Now they'll settle in Palestine. They're at a tribal level organization, but because they're being pressured by the Philistines, Goliath from the David and Goliath story was a Philistine, they will eventually form a united kingdom, led first by this guy named Saul, but he'll be succeeded by King David. And David's son Solomon will take the Ark of the Covenant and build a building for it. David had just kept the Ark of the Covenant in a tent, but Solomon will build a big building for it called the Temple. And in this class, I'm not too big on punctuation and on capitalization, but it is important that it is the temple. Right? There's only one, because Jews said there's only one God, and he's worshipped in only this one place. Right? So if you want to worship God, you need to come to this one place. Right? This is where the one place you could properly worship God. So the next question was, no one asked about 28, so we'll skip on to 29. What was the Babylonian captivity? Why is it significant? Well, remember, the Assyrians will destroy the northern half of the Jewish kingdom, and then later the southern half and the temple would be destroyed by the Babylonians. Right? And these are the Babylonians from the Bible. So the Babylonians will come in, destroy the temple, and they don't want the Jewish people to rebel, so they force Jewish leaders, so like priests, scribes, the aristocracy, the kings, they all have to leave Jerusalem and go to Babylon, right? They say, if we leave them here, they can lead a rebellion against us. It's much harder for them to lead a rebellion in Babylon when there's not that many Jewish people there. And this is called the Babylonian captivity. And this is very important because this was really a threat to the Jewish identity. We lost our temple. This is the one place where we were able to worship God. How do we stay a people when what defined us was worshiping God in this way? And what this led to then was the writing of the Torah, what Christians call the Old Testament, what Jews would call the Torah, or we may call the Hebrew Scripture, but basically the first 5 books of the Bible, right? So Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and I always, okay. Leviticus, thank you. Right, so embarrassed myself on tape there. So that's what leads them, right? They're under threat. Their identity's under threat. They want to preserve the stories, at least, that made them a special people, and they do that by writing them down. Right, so we're going to write this down. We've lost the temple, but we can preserve our identity in this way. Now, eventually, the Persians will defeat the Babylonians, and King Cyrus will allow the Hebrews to return to Israel and rebuild the temple. He actually goes so far as helping them to rebuild the temple. right? He'll actually give the money to help them build it again. So that's why it's back when Jesus shows up, right? Because there's two of them. One got destroyed, got rebuilt, got destroyed, has not yet been rebuilt. So that leads us to the next question. What were the characteristics of the Persian Empire? Why was it able to last longer than the Assyrian Empire and was remembered more fondly? And I use that example, as you can see here. The Assyrian Empire, I mean, it was impressive, included the entire Fertile Crescent, but the Persian Empire had that, much of modern Turkey and modern Iran. So the Persians did a lot better. Why? Well, we can see that by returning this guy, Cyrus the Great, right? Like I said, I want to emphasize the Persian Empire is based in modern day Iran. Iranian people still consider themselves connected to it. But Cyrus the Great, right, he was a good general with a powerful army, but the same could have been said about the Assyrians. But whereas the Assyrians went into cities and killed people and skinned them and hung their skins on cities, Cyrus did things like letting the Jews go home and helping them rebuild their temple. So he was able to present himself as a liberator. Oh, those Babylonians came in and made you leave your home and sent you into exile? I'll let you go back and I'll help you rebuild. And one other thing about him, whereas the Assyrians were quite nasty and would just execute people left and right, when he conquered people, he would often incorporate them into his governing structure. So, for example, if he conquered Greenwood, he wouldn't say to the mayor of Greenwood, hey, I'm firing you, or I'm going to kill you, which the Assyrians certainly would have done. Instead, he says, now you're working for me. Don't rebel, pay the taxes to me, and everything's good. And he even did this with kings. So he would take the title King of Kings, because he would actually conquer complete other kingdoms and let the kings continue to rule, so long as they paid their taxes and didn't cause trouble, and gave him soldiers when he wanted. And the Persians were also religiously and culturally tolerant. And one thing I think is cool about the Persians was wherever they went, the number of slaves tended to go down. They didn't seem to much like slavery and tried to reduce it whenever possible. So we had another question. What are the characteristics, 31, of Zoroastrianism, the teaching of Zoroaster? And we emphasized that Zoroaster taught there were two gods, a good god and an evil god. Right? He called the good god Ahura Mazda. I don't expect you to remember that name, but I will mention it later. And Zoroaster taught that people had free will to choose between them. You can choose the good God, you can choose the bad God, it's up to you. But you better choose the good God because good will triumph in the end. The good God will reward those who supported him and punish the people who disobeyed him and help the evil God in a final judgment. So you better just play on the right team. And this religion united the Persian royalty, and they were tolerant of other religions. So they didn't say you have to join our religion. In part, I think, because they focused so much on just doing good, not so much on what you believed. Later on, they'll become more intolerant, but for now, they're pretty tolerant. Now, this didn't mean that they couldn't go out and conquer, right? Religion was fine with that. Ahura Mazda, the good God, was just fine with them conquering. And I gave you this quote from Darius, this is what I did by the favor of Ahura Mazda, the good God, and won the same year after I became king. 19 battles I fought, by the favor of Ahura Mazda, I smote them and took prisoner 9 kings. Right? And in the picture, you can see Ahura Mazda looking down on Darius and the kings he has taken prisoner. Right? So they're just fine with conquest. And I'll just go really quickly. We had this question, how was the empire held together physically? Remember, Darius built a lot of roads. The Persians built a lot of roads, and they made sure those roads were patrolled by soldiers and had watchtowers to guide the roads, and they had rest areas so people could travel on them. And in areas that weren't easily accessed by roads, they would build canals, like the one they built to connect Egypt to be a part of their empire. Someone had a question about Phoenicians, but we went over the Phoenicians already.